What's up guys, Mike here, the Detroit Borg with the all-new MacBook Air. This is so overdue I never thought we would actually see it. So this is the first time the MacBook Air has been completely redesigned since 2010. In fact, MacBook Air was one of the first Macs I ever reviewed. And since the MacBook Air has been one of the most popular laptops of all time, I think this is kind of a big deal. So this new MacBook Air retails for $1199 alongside the $999 of the original MacBook Air. So a $200 premium brings you a lot more modern amenities, including a Retina display. We also get the new 3rd generation butterfly style keyboard, along with a Force Touch trackpad, Touch ID, much better speakers, a more compact form factor, along with more modern processors and Thunderbolt 3 ports. And of course, because the MacBook Air is available in 3 colors this time, we're going to take a look at all 3 of them side by side, so maybe you get an idea of what color you might prefer. Now strangely, the MacBook Air only comes with one processor. This is a dual-core, 8th generation Core i5 clocked at 1.6 GHz. Now this is actually a custom 7-watt Y-class processor. This replaces the 15-watt U-class processors from the old MacBook Air, but those are really old 5th generation processors, and we'll talk about performance a bit later. The base configuration gets you 120 gigs of PCIe based SSD storage, which you can upgrade to 1.5 terabytes. 8 gigs of DDR3 RAM is standard, running at 2133 megahertz, and you can upgrade to 16 gigs. Onto the accessories, taking a look at the paperwork first, we get something we don't see terribly often, which you can see peeking through the hole in the packet, but we get some color matching Apple stickers. So if you get the silver version, it's just basically white, but if you get space gray or gold, you get these metallic Apple stickers, which pretty accurately reflect the color of the anodized aluminum. So we've seen this with the 12-inch MacBook, and we see this with the iMac Pro and the Mac Pros, so at least we see it with the MacBook Airs. In terms of our charging adapter, this is a 30-watt USB-C charger, so this is up from the 29-watt charger we used to get with the 12-inch MacBook. We also have a set of folding prongs, which will pop off so you can add an extension cable or an international wall adapter. And spoiler alert, if you didn't know already, the MacBook Air did lose the MagSafe power connector, so now we're on to USB-C, which is the cable we get in the box. Although the MacBook Air did not get the Touch Bar, it did get Touch ID, and this is by far the cheapest way of getting Touch ID on the Mac. So during the setup process, you're prompted to train your finger. Now this can be used to unlock your MacBook Air, authenticate payments, or authenticate passwords. MacBook Air also gets hands-free Siri. This is thanks to the new T2 chip. This actually remains somewhat rare on the Mac lineup. Only the MacBook Pro and the iMac Pro currently have this. MacBook Air did go on a diet, so it's down to about 2.75 pounds from 3 pounds. So it's not a night and day difference. It's also quite a bit more compact than the old MacBook Air. In fact, it has the exact same footprint as the 13-inch MacBook Pro. By far the biggest and most overdue improvement for the MacBook Air is the new Retina display. So just like the MacBook Pro, this is a 13.3-inch display with a resolution of 2560 by 1600. That's up considerably from the 1440 by 900 resolution of the old 13.3-inch display. This is the most affordable Retina display on a Mac and produces 48% more color than the old design. We also get 4 million pixels, up from 1 million pixels. The other big change is IPS over TN. So the old TN display had terrible off-axis viewing angles. So as you tilt the screen, you can see just how bad the distortion was. Also gone from the old display is that wide bezel, which was wrapped in aluminum. So now we have an edge-to-edge glass panel, which is also more anti-reflective than the old glossy panel. So if you look side by side, you'll still see glare, but it's definitely not as bad as it used to be. It's quite a bit more tinted. At first glance, it looks like the MacBook Air has the exact same display as the MacBook Pro 13-inch, but that's not exactly the case. Although we have the same screen resolution and the quality is still pretty good, we're still lacking a few features like True Tone, which matches the white balance to the ambient light in the room. And the maximum brightness of the MacBook Air is 300 nits versus 500 nits for the MacBook Pro. Now you can really only achieve maximum brightness in direct lighting, such as when you're outdoors, so you can't really ramp up the brightness to this level. So in my case, I'm just shining lights directly at the ambient light sensors to bring up the maximum brightness. And you can see there is a difference. The other difference is that the MacBook Air lacks support for the DCI-P3 color gamut. Although this is still a very vibrant and colorful display, whites aren't quite as clear as they are on the MacBook Pro, and colors like green and reds aren't quite as vibrant. We also get the new 3rd generation butterfly style keyboard, the same one that debuted with the 2018 MacBook Pro. So the new design is quieter, and they've improved durability by adding a membrane underneath each key, which keeps dust out. But this keyboard is a huge change from the old keyboard. I'm actually a big fan of the butterfly style keyboard just because the keys are wider, so they're easier to strike, and the keys are far more stable, so they don't wobble around like they did with the old MacBook Air. And because there's much less mechanical travel, these keys are actually really fast to type on. I'm a really fast fast typer, so I actually appreciate a shallow keyboard just because that means you're working less to press the keys. But obviously preferences differ quite a bit, and I think it just takes a little time to get used to the new keyboard before dismissing it. We also get improved backlighting because each key gets an individual LED light, so you can see much less light leaking around the keys, and each key character is more brightly lit. Once again, the brightness of the keyboard is adaptive to the ambient lights, but you can also manually adjust the brightness of the keyboard from the function row. This is the first Mac keyboard that gets Touch ID without a touch bar. Typically that's been combined, but now we have a separate key just for it. This still acts as a power button, and like other Touch ID sensors, it's covered in sapphire crystal. MacBook Air also finally gets the Force Touch trackpad, replacing the mechanical trackpad of the old design. So instead of the diving board style trackpad which was hinged toward the top, we have a larger trackpad surface which responds to pressure and simulates a click thanks to a haptic motor. So that clicking sensation and the sound is pretty much indistinguishable from a physical click. But because we have the exact same force sensors across the entire surface, you can press anywhere on the surface and get the exact same response. This trackpad is slightly smaller than the one on the MacBook Pro, so there's a little more room on either side, but generally speaking, the trackpad does have excellent palm rejection, so you can rest your palms directly on the trackpad without triggering it. On either side of the keyboard are front-facing stereo speakers, which are a big improvement over the under-keyboard design we had before. These are 25% louder with twice the bass and a much wider stereo sound, so these speakers are much more immersive than the more muffled distant speakers we had before.
Starfleet is a promise. I give my life for you, you give your life for me. I give my life for you, you give your life for me. And nobody gets left behind. And nobody gets left behind.
Not surprisingly, the new MacBook Air replaced all of its old ports with two Thunderbolt 3 ports on the left side. So gone is the SD card reader, Thunderbolt 2, and the USB-A ports. Also gone is the MagSafe connector. Now personally, I've never been a big fan of MagSafe just because I think it comes off way too easily, and I definitely prefer a universal charging standard, which means I have less cables and adapters to keep around. Thunderbolt 3 and USB-C certainly opens up the MacBook Air to a world of much powerful accessories. So you can connect this to a 5K display, you have data transfer speeds up to 40 megs per second, and you can even connect an external GPU to improve graphics performance by up to 17 times. MacBook Air certainly isn't the first Mac to go USB-C only, so there's quite a few adapters out there, and for the most part, the only adapter I actually need is an SD card reader. Otherwise, I'm able to use USB-C for basically everything. At the top edge of the glass is the Facetime HD Camera, still recording at 720p. We also get an LED indicator and the ambient light sensors nearby. We also have a 3-microphone array, which is used for better voice recognition for Siri. And what's kind of interesting is that the microphones are controlled by the T2 chip, and when you close the lid of the MacBook Air, it actually mechanically disconnects the microphones, which means software, good or otherwise, can't get around this interrupt. On the underside of the MacBook Air is a single panel which is held on with pentalobe screws. Those screws are actually color matched to the aluminum finish, which is kind of a nice detail. We also have those plastic feet at all four corners which protect the bottom of the MacBook Air. Similar to the old MacBook Air, ventilation is hidden within the hinge, but this time the hinge is integrated into the aluminum unibody of the design as opposed to a black plastic strip. So it's a much cleaner design consistent with all of the other Macs. In terms of the color selection, silver is certainly not a new color. We've had this since the beginning, but Space Gray finally makes it to the MacBook Air, although this is a color we've seen on the 12-inch MacBook and the MacBook Pro for a number of years. But a new color here is gold, and Apple keeps tweaking the gold color, so now it's been updated to reflect the gold color that's also on the newest iPad 6th generation and the Apple Watch. So this is more of a coppery gold color. It's quite a bit warmer than the yellow gold and not quite as pink as the rose gold. Incidentally, the 12-inch MacBook was also updated to get this new color. Personally, I'm still a huge fan of Space Gray, but no matter what color you get, you also get a matching Apple logo on the back. So this is a polished inset Apple logo, replacing the backlit Apple logo of the old MacBook Air. Another color matching detail is the MacBook text on the front of the display. So if you look closer, you'll see that it actually matches the aluminum finish. In terms of performance, I mentioned earlier that this is running a 7-watt Core i5 processor, which sounds less powerful than the 15-watt Core i5 or Core i7 from the old MacBook Air. But if you take a look at the Geekbench scores, you can see that this Core i5 still beats those old processors, so this is still a faster computer. And even though we have a more powerful computer and a slightly smaller battery, this MacBook Air achieves the same battery life as the old MacBook Air. So that gives you about 12 hours of wireless web browsing, which is the best among all of the MacBooks. In terms of performance, this entire video was actually made on the MacBook Air, and although it's quite a bit slower than my iMac Pro, which I normally use, it's certainly doable. It definitely keeps the fans running, at least if you're doing background processing, but otherwise it's actually pretty smooth. Now, what makes the MacBook Air a little confusing for shoppers is that it slots between two different computers with very similar pricing. So we have the 12-inch MacBook and the 13-inch MacBook Pro without Touch Bar. So the 12-inch MacBook and the MacBook Air are the exact same price, $1199, while the MacBook Pro is only $100 more. The big selling point for the MacBook remains its size and weight. It's still quite a bit smaller and lighter than the MacBook Air. It's at 2 pounds versus 2.75 pounds. It's also the only fanless Mac you can buy, so it's always going to be silent. But naturally, this is not geared toward performance. A few other quirks about the MacBook include a 480p Facetime camera and a single USB-C connector, so no Thunderbolt ports here. And although the 12-inch has a smaller Retina display, it's basically got the same specs as the MacBook Air, so it doesn't have True Tone, doesn't have the DCI-P3 spec, and it only achieves about 300 nits of total brightness. As I've already mentioned, the MacBook Air is actually very similar to the MacBook Pro in terms of its size and screen, and most of the features are very similar. The major difference really comes down to performance and some of the display specs. So again, the display isn't as bright or colorful as the MacBook Pro, and the MacBook Pro offers better CPUs and graphics. But the MacBook Air gains an edge with Touch ID, longer battery life, and it's slightly lighter than the 3-pound MacBook Pro. In terms of performance between these three, predictably the MacBook Air slots right between them. Much more powerful than the 12-inch MacBook's baseline configuration, but not quite as powerful as the baseline MacBook Pro. Although if you look at that single core score, you can see the MacBook Air is getting quite close. But the big selling point for the MacBook Air is that it's the most current of these three. The MacBook and the MacBook Pro without the Touch Bar haven't been updated for 2018, so they're overdue. So either they're going to update these in 2019 or the MacBook Air is going to be expanded to fill their spots. As always, Apple doesn't make it easy to decide which Mac to get. I definitely think it's worth the $200 upgrade from the old MacBook Air, and I would still choose it over the MacBook and the baseline MacBook Pro, just because it's the most current and offers the best form factor and dollar value. But if you want the best power for the least amount of money, definitely go for the MacBook Pro. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed this look at the MacBook Air. If you guys enjoyed this video, please let me know with a like, and I'll see you again in my next video.